Hey, welcome back to Crit Catch. I'm Michael.
I'm Skyler.
One day we won't have to introduce ourselves every episode, but you know.
Nah, it's a thing now.
So last episode we were kind of talking about like status ailments and stuff, and
I have a thing to start us off with.
yeah, go for it.
Well, related to status ailments, but you were talking about just sort of obstacles in general, and you used the word bypass, which I thought was really interesting because I think like anything you're presented with in a game, depending on the sort of dynamic play structure of the game, and what I mean by that is like the actual gameplay itself. Like, is this like a stealthy kind of game? Is this just a frontline RPG where you literally have to walk into these monsters and fight them? So like you bypassing a challenge is you getting around these monsters in a way that you don't have to fight them at this point.
That's fair
knowing
assessment.
that you don't have to go to the chests or whatever, so it's fuck it, I'm not going to fight those monsters. That feels like bypassing. Really, it's sort of interacting or conflicting with whatever the there's probably a better word for that, but it almost seems like if you can't bypass something, you either have to meet it head on or figure out a way to negate it. So in the sense of like the ailment, how can I deal with this in such a way that it is not going to greatly affect me while still being in the, I don't know, presence of its bullshit. She misses a lot with that axe.
I think that's a fair. I think it's a fair statement. I mean, some of that's semantic because I use the word bypass, and normally the word bypass means just like get around.
I was just extrapolating off of it.
No, yeah, I think that's actually a completely fair sort of take.
Because I think there are definitely games that present you with that option. Like, nah, fuck this.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Like from that semantic level, you know, how do you think about the concept of bypassing versus negation? Because, I mean, I guess on the root concept of those words, negation implies that you have now nullified the thing, but the thing still happens. Whereas
like you're
bypass,
invincible to its nonsense.
and depending on how you want to look at it, they can mean the same thing, but they could also have that slight nuance of, you know, it's not just. There's a difference between stopping an enemy from using the ability altogether through maybe some sort of gimmick in the AI versus.
What happened to my mic? I'm just going to move it really quick. You keep talking.
I had to move it a bit when I closed the door again.
All right, I'm back.
But there is a difference between like stopping an enemy by manipulating the AI or maybe manipulating the system versus working within the parameters the developers intended. And I actually, you know, using the Dark Souls example again.
You found Meteor.
I did. I just found a meteor sitting in a chest. You know,
make this into a sword.
Yep.
That Sokka would be proud of.
No, actually, I'm just. God. I'm actually
Goodbye,
just gonna
space sword.
chuck meteors at things. That's such a great show.
Yeah, it is.
But yeah, like I think the Dark Souls example, like there are times when you can, you know, bait the enemy's AI into walking off of cliffs or things, or even in Demon Souls there was the old king boss, like he was one of the optional bosses, and he was, you know, he had a lot of health. He was really resilient.
I legitimately tried to fight him quite a few times.
Yeah, and you could do that. You could also stand at max range from his aggro radius, like outside of his room, basically.
Shoot him with arrows.
And you could arc arrows over the stairs and just kill him, and he would just eat it. Or, I mean, that's kind of like my go-to Skyrim example of stabbing the Greybeards over and over again to level up my sneak. Like,
yeah.
Because as long, like, you don't know what that is. Basically, the Greybeards are invincible because they're story-required NPCs, and in order to level up sneak, you have to be doing something sneaky. And backstabbing counts as being sneaky.
You know, go on.
And so basically, you wait for them to be asleep, you stab them from a crouching position, which gets you sneak levels or sneak experience. They wake up, open up.
Of course.
So you get that experience, but because the AI hasn't triggered yet to recognize that you're there, they go back to sleep, and you just repeat that. And so that, in a sense, is bypassing. That was wrong. But that, in a sense, I think is bypassing the mechanic, because the intention in an RPG is that you engage with the action in order to get better.
I think I'm not pointing to any sort of like derivative means here, but I love in the D&D community they have a couple words about like how the rules are followed, and one is rules as written, following it to the letter, like to the T, and the other one is rules as intended.
Right.
And I think that is a very good way of sort of breaking down a little bit like what you're talking about. Rules as written makes absolute sense. Like, hey, I'm just gonna fucking level my little like stibby stab skill with these guys that won't die and ever get mad at me, because that's how the rules, work.
Right.
Rules as written. Rules as intended. Yeah, they probably figured you'd backstab like 500 different guys before. Yeah. So, and I think a little bit of, talking about trying to like bypass stuff and circling around is not even rules as written from a from the perspective of the player, but we were talking about how I mentioned, like poison damage is just sort of this institutionalized thing. It's this damage you take over time, no matter where you get it from. And sort of how you interact with that, has that just basically been the same for like 20 or 30 years at this point? Because I have some similar, talking about like institutionalized mechanics. I really don't like games where you have an inventory, where you pick up like trash loot, where you then have to then turn around and go and sell that stuff.
Like gray items and stuff. So not even...
Yeah,
because you see this in MMOs a lot. They give you like, gnarled branches and this crap that is literally vendor trash, for the sake of like realism, but it's kind of just an impediment.
Yeah, honestly, they could just drop the gold and that would be the same effect at that point. I've always, because there's single player games that emulate that too, and I've always kind of wondered why that was such a like a hold fast as far as like sticking to that model, because all it is it's actually just a time sink.
Yeah, and some of that I think is rooted in sort of different just opinions of how role playing works. Because I think that's a fairly common. I mean, you even see it, talking about MMOs, you see it fairly common in terms of like what role playing really represents to somebody, and the idea that like you can find all of this junk lying around for some people is kind of an immersive piece to the world, and for other people the frequency with which it happens makes it that impediment, because at some point when you've dealt with your 200,000th piece of vendor trash, the immersion of the world starts mattering less than the representation of like annoyance.
Yeah.
And like I've actually seen people like for Final Fantasy XIV, for instance. Final Fantasy XIV directly puts loot in your inventory, and there is no vendor trash.
Okay.
Like now there may be things that are, there may be items that you pick up that are less valuable to the economy of your server, at which point you don't. You just don't deal with them. But at the same time, there are people that are kind of annoyed by the fact that there's not vendor trash, or there's something that they liked about looting a body because it felt more realistic. And a lot of that is born, I mean, historically, that literalism is how a lot of the early RPGs, which eventually became the source for MMOs and things like that. That's how they did everything. It was like if you go back and you look at early games like Ultima, where which I mean I love the Ultima series, but it is very difficult to play a lot of the early ones. They have command keys.
Ultima Online.
Oh, yeah. I'm talking before that, like the actual main series. They have commands for literally everything. Like your entire keyboard is taken up with commands, and each key represents something individual, and that comes from that kind of D&D, I can interact with everything mentality. You similarly have games that have lots of different skills. I mean, even going back to, a lot of people complained in the Elder Scrolls series about how they've sort of pared down the amount of individual skills and how that hurts. And to be clear, I'm not saying it's right or wrong one way or the other.
It's right. I'll say it.
I think in a lot of cases it is.
Hard stance.
From an ease of use perspective, it is, and from an ease of design perspective, it is a lot of times, because for as many different options as that can present, there's always something that's kind of an optimal option, and depending on the community you have, it's especially in a game where you have lots of cooperation that requires lots of damage to get stuff done or whatever. Like in multiplayer spaces, throw lots of kinks into this mix. Sorry, I got stuck on multiplayer spaces throwing lots of kinks and remembering some of the stuff I've walked into in MMOs. I'll never forget the gigantic char in Guild Wars 2, like this gigantic cat man with no clothes on in a bed with, what were the little floppy eared, the Asurans? Mm-hmm. They were definitely role-playing some kinky stuff, and I mean, good on them, but I was just like, the logistics of an 8-foot tall cat man and a 2-foot tall whatever you are, just...
bunny.
Yeah, that good on you.
Give it the old college try.
Yeah. Yep. But there's a lot of kinks that get thrown into that because people start, say, getting rejected from parties because they can't pull DPS, because even though they're playing the thing that is what they like, if it's not optimal, if it prevents them from pulling the level of weight that you need, then that becomes an ostracization. And so from that perspective, as a designer, it is valuable to cull a lot of that for the sake of everybody's community. And then you start getting into arguments of the game is diluted, but then diluted to whom? The people that do the excluding because of the weird needs of DPS. Yeah. Because I mean, for that dilution, you're basically saying that your method of playing is the only right method of playing, and that the game should cater to that method specifically.
I mean, you see that sort of mentality all the time, unfortunately, which is, I think, especially in the video game industry. I mean, what was it? EA 2 years in a row got rated the worst company in America. Next to banks, next to Wells Fargo.
Well, specifically, specifically against those were the years that a lot of the the mortgage crisis was going around, and so which, to be clear, there are a lot of bad quality of life practices or business practices that have happened at EA. So that is in no way a defense. But one, they just became the internet scapegoat in general because lots of companies, and we're actually seeing a lot more of that now. There's a lot more reporting going on about how bad it is at a lot of game companies now.
Thank God for reports.
But so for EA to get singled out like that, I don't know that I can honestly say that I think that was anything more than gamers just kind of being mad at EA for whatever reason gamers were mad. Like microtransactions or whatever.
EA has given them plenty of reasons. But
yeah, but there is that kind of hyperbolic internet reaction that says this is the worst, even though there are people whose literal financial security and lives in general were ruined by other companies, and it was just it was internet brigading kind of stuff. But so I mean that all that to say this community reaction exists, and it does come into play because it makes people think things like, well, this is how the game needs to be from this perspective. And sometimes it's right. Sometimes the thing that services, I think, the top level or whatever the kind of community, whatever that community thinks in terms of like mechanics that help with things like rating or whatever. The way that works.
Here we are. Don't you need to go down that vine?
Yeah. The thing that like makes that work is ultimately what's best for the game's health, but sometimes it's not. And that requires a lot more data to make an assessment than just being on the player end.
Uh-oh.
Well, next time on Crit Couch, we're not gonna give up.
Fucking Mystic Quest.